I'm Jean-Charles Picot, and I would like to thank the committee of the NNI Nutrition to invite me to talk about nutrition of the first 2 years of life and the risk of obesity and NCDs. I'm going to present some data that were published and we worked on in our units. Here are my disclosures. As you know, obesity is a leading cause of global deaths, mainly due to the associated non-communicable diseases associated with the obesity. It's responsible for about 40% of diabetes and 23% of ischemic heart disease. So it reduces quality of life and induces premature mortality. One of the risk factors of the adult obesity is childhood obesity, and the prevalence of childhood obesity increased by eightfold in the last 4 decades. So we know also that the treatment of childhood obesity is low efficiency and it's costly. So really cost-effective prevention strategies are needed, and early nutritional intervention could be one of them. The risk factors for obesity in infancy and childhood are listed here. The main of them, maternal BMI before conception, also the gestational weight gain at a lesser level, also infant feeding and growth trajectories, meaning that rapid growth and high BMI during infancy, and the question of the type of feeding is important. Having no breastfeeding or short duration breastfeeding, receiving an infant formula with the question of the impact of protein intake could be has been identified as a factor. Complementary fatty feeding and particularly introduction before 4 months is also identified as a risk factor. But also the portion sizes, the poor diet quality, unhealthy dietary pattern, and it's mainly at that time related to the familial feeding practice, and also low physical activity, as you know. So early intervention could be quite easily performed when considering the infant feeding during the first 2 years of life. And we are going to discuss about the impact of breastfeeding and infant formula. When considering the question of breastfeeding and obesity, one of the first study, which was really a big and nice study performed by Von Kries in 1999, showed that there was a clear difference in the prevalence of obesity between infants that were breastfed and those who were not. 2.8% versus 4.5%, and there was a dose response relationship that was identified in this study. And at the end, the key message of this study was that there was a 35% reduction in obesity prevalence in breastfed infants for 3 to 5 months. And then there was a lot of discussions around this topic, and from meta-analyses that have been published afterwards, we can consider that there is a modest but consistent protective effect of breastfeeding against obesity in later life, with a risk reduction which is quite variable, going from 12 to 20%, around 20%. And there is also some data showing that there is an additional risk reduction which corresponds to the dose response effect. Here's a nice data presented by Bert Kolecko from the publication from Rezac in 2017, showing different BMI growth trajectories in a huge number of infants, and in identifying that there are more than half of the babies that grow parallel to the median percentile of WHO chart. But there are also 2 other profiles who are growing too rapidly, and these 2 profiles are associated with an increased obesity risk. And in this study, it was identified that those who were not fully breastfed or breastfed for less than 4 months had a significantly greater risk to be in the 2 growth trajectories with increased obesity risk. The question always with this type of report is what is the impact of the breast effect, meaning that the behavior, the feeding behavior of the breastfeeding mother and the family could be different than when the baby is fed a formula. We know that the profile and are different between breastfeeding mothers and a mother who is not breastfeeding. So this could have an effect, but probably likely later impact. And the main point is probably the milk effect, which corresponds to different composition between human milk and formula. And there are the protein question, protein to energy ratio, which is a very important point. And the excessive protein intake related to the excessive protein content of formula that are marketed, and microbiome could have an influence, and also hormones, but these two factors are still under study. But main key point could be the protein intake, and you can see here the data coming from a large survey, French survey that was published in 2021, and they define a few categories of feeding at 4 months, and those who were receiving very low, so-called very low amount of protein, from low, intermediate, high, and very high protein intake. And as you can see, there is a relation between the group, the feeding group at 4 months, and the BMI at 6 and 12 months. So the thing that we know, that's the protein intake is excessive during the first years of life. And then we know that the recommended intake are between 1.8 at 1 month to 1 gram per kilo per day at 24 months. And when expressing this recommendation in percent of total energy intake, at 6 months, it's expected to be 5.6, and 24 months, 3.8%. And as you can see, upper limit has been defined. And you can see that human milk has a percentage of protein the protein as total energy intake of 5%, which is 20% for whole milk. It's about 8 to 9% for follow-on and infant formula, and it's about 15 to 20% for the complementary feeding. So it's quite important values, and it has been shown in Europe, in US, and in Australia in different study and different times that the protein ingested by the infants is about 2 to 3 times greater than the needs. And you can see here the numbers, which are quite higher than what is expected at this age. Then in this context, there were some studies that tried to look at the impact of early protein intake in healthy term infants on a further risk of obesity. And one of the most famous and earliest study on this topic was the CHOP study, which was a big randomized European trial. And it was comparing two groups, one receiving a so-called low protein intake, 1.8 during the first 4 months, between second to the third and fourth months, and then 2.9, and the second group was receiving 2.2 and then 4.4 gram per 100 kcal, which is close to core milk. So it's quite important protein intake. And there was a reference group of babies receiving human milk from breastfeeding. So we will see that there are other studies, but we are going just to look at what was one of the main results of the CHOP study. It shows really that the use of infant follow-on formula with a high protein content double the obesity rate at 6 years. It's a very brief slide to summarize a huge amount of publication from this study, and very interesting data coming out from this randomized trial. At that time, once again, it was quite important protein intake when compared to the recommendation at that time. And from this study, an important early protein hypothesis was built and confirmed, suggesting that the high protein intake is inducing secretion of an increasing concentration of insulin-releasing amino acid, which will induce an increase in insulin and IGF-1 with a subsequent increase in weight gain and adipogenicity, and then later obesity and NCDs. And a few publications try to investigate the mechanism of this early protein hypothesis with quite interesting subject around the branch chain amino acids concentrations. So we'll now go deeply inside this hypothesis, which has been investigated, and for sure, when you have a very high protein intake, you have some consequences. And in summary, we can summarize the CHOP study by saying that it showed that healthy term infants fed a high protein infant and follow-on formula during the first year of life presented a greater weight gain and BMI, which persisted at 6 years. That means that feeding such formula seems to increase the risk of later obesity. At that time, a high protein content of the formula was proposed because of the poor quality of protein in the formula, or let's say the suboptimal quality of the protein. But it was probably not anymore appropriate, and particularly for follow-on formula later on. So there is a need for a decrease in recommended protein content for the marketed formula, and a need to evaluate new formula which decrease the protein content. And you can see that the recommendation from the European regulation show that for infant formula and follow-on formula, the protein content that was recommended was decreased between 1991 and the last recommendation in 2012. So there was a decrease, sometimes in the lower limit, sometimes in the upper limit, but then there were quite a significant decrease from 1991 to the most recent years. In this context, the EPOC study was performed in the units, and it was a monocentric study comparing babies receiving 1.5 versus 2.7 gram protein per 100 kcal, and that was compared to a breastfed group. And these infants were receiving the same formula from birth. There was no period before the beginning of the study. Very early after birth, it started. And what has been shown in this study is that there was no difference between the two formula groups for growth that was within the reference value for breastfed infants, which is here the dotted lines. And there was IGF-1 concentration which was similar between the two groups, and also, as you can see here, the fat mass which was measured, and it was not estimated through the BMI, but it was measured and with PPOD, and then the DEXA, and there was no significant difference except a difference at the beginning, which was present at birth and still persistent at 4 months between the group 1.8 and the breastfed infants. During that time, Ferdinand Reschke published a meta-analysis of 9 NCDs, looking at what was the growth during the 4 months of life for babies fed a 1.8 gram protein per 100 kcal with an improved quality of the protein. And what was found, it was that there was no difference from the WHO standard. It's collecting data from different studies and made in different countries in different settings. It was quite a huge number of infants, suggesting the safety of this type of formulas. And then later on, more recently, the Proteus study was performed. It was another manufacturer, another type of protein that was used, another mixture. And then it was comparing a 2.1 gram protein per 100 kcal versus a 1.7. It was a 20% reduction in the amount of protein given to the baby, and again, a breastfeeding reference group. And the outcome was the weight gain between 1 and 4 months. And it was similar between the two types of formula, and both formula, it was higher than the breastfed groups. And at 2 years, there was a similar growth, including the BMI and body composition measurement that was performed in this study between the two formulas. And there was a higher fat mass index in the infant formula-fed infants, the formula-fed infants and the breastfed infants. In summary, the studies EPOC and Proteus that evaluated formula at 1.7, 1.8 gram per 100 kcal with a high quality protein show that it's possible to reduce by 20 to 30% the protein content of formula without impacting growth, the quality of growth and biological markers during the first year of life. And this effect persisted at 2 to 5 years. And the growth was always still again higher than in the breastfed group, suggesting that the protein content could be further reduced. From that point of view, Ziegler published in 2015 a study where he compared follow-on formula that was a standard versus a 1.6 gram per 100 kcal, which is a reduction of 25% of the protein amount, and which was below the regulatory minimum level at that time, 1.8. And there was no difference again between the growth of these infants when compared to WHO reference. There was a lower weight than the standard protein intake formula, and the weight was higher than in breastfed groups. So infants fed between 3 and 12 months of follow-on formula with a low, very low amount of protein, which is going closer and closer to human milk, which is about 1.4, as we said. There was it was below the regulatory minimum level, but they presented a normal growth lower than the infant fed conventional formula, but not significantly different from the WHO reference values. And the growth was still higher than in breastfed infants. And then we in this context we performed the study, the SHAPE study that was presented during this meeting. With first results were presented yesterday, and it was comparing two types of formula during the first year of life, with a protein content that was adapted with a group of babies receiving 1.85 gram protein per 100 kcal during the first 4 months of life, and then 1.5, and the other group starting higher and then doing the same than the first group. And we look at the growth data, and as you can see, the weight gain velocity from 0 to 6 months, that was the end point, was not different. Was not different between the two groups. It was non-inferior to the WHO standard, and was non-inferior to the breastfed group, and it was for boys and girls. And weight gain velocity were significantly higher than WHO in both regimen for girls. And here you can see the anthropometry and body composition data. As you can see, the weight for length z-score is presented here, and there was no difference between the formula-fed infants and the breastfed, and between the two formula-fed infants group, and there was at different time points the growth. The weight for length z-score was different from breastfed infants, but the difference was quite small. As you can see, it was 0.4, 0.5 standard deviation difference, and the mean head circumference was higher than the WHO standard. There was no difference between the two groups, and it was a bit higher than the breastfed infants during some part of the study, but it was not significant. So from the body composition point of view and the biological markers, there was no difference in glucose, leptin, adiponectin, and IGF-1. And the person body fat was higher in both formula groups than in breastfed group at age of 3 months, but there was no more difference at age of 12 months. We'll have some data up to 4 years, but it's still ongoing, and we are going to present these data in the next years. In summary, SHAPE study, the first results from the SHAPE study show that the infants fed the formula at 1.85 and then 1.5 gram protein per 100 kcal, which is close to human milk, present a 1-year growth and body composition, which is similar to WHO reference and breastfed infants. So then the development and the growth of babies at 4 years is still ongoing, and we're waiting for the next results. As a conclusion, I would say that the excessive protein intake during the first year of life is probably mostly due to the protein content of infant and full-on formula, and also to complementary feeding. Very high protein intakes induce rapid weight gain and high percent fat mass. That has been shown by a CHOP study. The reduction of protein content in infant formula and full-on formula close to levels close to human milk allows normal growth, including L circumference, that is close to the WHO reference values, but growth remain higher than in breastfed infants for weight and length, both, but composition and hormonal metabolic profile are close to breastfed infants. The prevention of childhood and adult obesity and associated NCDs require a multifaceted strategy, and reduction of protein content in formula. It was previously progressively done for infant formula. I think it should be done also for full-on formula. Is part of this strategy, together with the maternal counseling about nutrition pre-pregnancy to avoid a high pre-pregnancy high BMI. It's also supporting breastfeeding, as we said previously, supporting healthy nutritional practice from the age of 4. It's a bit provocative just saying that the timing and the type of complementary feeding could be also a factor that should be investigated and improved. And also healthy lifestyle, as we know about the physical activity, which is important. So once again, the protein intake is not the only point to prevent childhood and adult obesity, but it seems to be quite an interesting way of preventing it. So I would like to thank you for your attention.